One-page rules. Now we're looking at Age of Fantasy Skirmish at the moment, but the discussion we're going to have today could be equally applied to just about any one of the members of the one-page rules family. Bit of a meta discussion, a bit of a discussion about how people talk about the one-page rules, and a bit of a discussion about why that is and how we all as a community might be able to fix that. What I have to say today should apply equally well to Grimdark, any of the Grimdark futures, maybe not so much the war fleets. I don't have any direct experience with that one, so maybe not. If you have experience and you think that what I'm talking about applies to that game as well, let me know down in the comments. I admit right out of the gate, I don't have nearly as much experience with these rules as a lot of channels. There are some great channels like Good Enough Gaming, that's apostrophe NUFF, Warboss Fits. Those are the two that come leaping to mind. I think Old Hammered has played a few games of this, but Warboss Fits and Good Enough Gaming are the two that are really dedicated to one-page rules family. My concern with how, and it's a meta discussion, so take that for what it's worth. My concern with how, well, let me back up a step. As a guy that plays this game semi-regularly, I often turn my algorithm in the hunt for discussion about one-page rules. Most of the discussion, and understandably so, a lot of it is about, oh, what's the new 3D prints that are out? Well, I'm not a 3D printer, I'm a gamer. Let's talk about an army list. And this is the one that predominates. And it does so because it's fairly cut and dried. You take an army list, you take a roster, and you go down the list of what's on the menu, what dishes can we select for the menu, and how can we best serve those. And in most cases, those videos are fairly self-explanatory. Hey guys, guess what? The units that have a really good armor score, 2s and 3s, they're great for holding objectives. The units that are fast can threaten multiple objectives, which causes headaches for your opponent. The units that have a really low combat score are good for attacking, and units that have impact are good for charging. Don't let them be charged. This is all fairly basic tactical advice for individual units, but I really think those discussions do the game a disservice. And I see this a lot when it comes to comparing the one-page rules to some of the other miniature war games out there these days. And I don't mean this as a criticism. It's perfectly understandable to start there. That's the beginning of wisdom. That's square one. That's start on the Monopoly board. You haven't even rolled the dice yet. And to be honest, I think that most people spend most of their time painting. But when it comes to engaging with the rules of one-page rules, they spend more time poring over army lists, min-maxing, not a bad thing, understanding what different units are capable of and how to use them, and just trying to fit different forces together. List building is a big part of the hobby, not a criticism. I think there's more list building going on. People spend more time doing that than they do sitting at the table. My hobby, though, is not list building. That's just one of the ingredients that goes into it. My hobby is gaming. If you're not sitting down to the table and playing the game, then the list building is enjoyable, but you're really not getting the full experience. And when we talk about the tactical abilities of these units, charging units should be, you charge with them, don't let them get charged. I get that. But how do you do that? Because in my mind, and particularly when it comes to selling this game to people who haven't tried it, the meat and bones, the really interesting part of this game is not roll to hit, roll to wound. Do you have regen, roll to save, or do you have an ability that blocks regen? That's not the interesting part. The real interesting part of this game comes in this paragraph right here. Each round, players alternate in activating one unit each, starting with the player that won the deployment roll-off. A lot of the times when I see guys sell the one-page rules, they sell playing the game from a very simple perspective, which may be good, right? You want a simple sales pitch. Hey, you don't have to sit and wait for 30 minutes while your opponent does all his stuff, and now it's your turn, and it's going to take you 30 minutes to do your stuff while he just sits there. In one-page rules, and it's worth pointing out, in one-page rules, in any given hour of play, first, you're going to do, well, whoever wins the initiative. I'm assuming you do because I like you, and maybe I even grant you the initiative because I like you so much. You're going to move one unit, and you're going to play for 5 minutes. Then I get to move a unit, and I get to play for 5 minutes. And so you have that engagement, and that's worth pointing out. But there is so much more to the game. There's so much more depth to this simple mechanic. What is this, 2 sentences? I do one, then you do one. The player that finished activating first on the last round gets to go first. If you have fewer units, you get to go first on subsequent rounds. That's huge. So today, I'm going to talk about that. And to do that, I'm going to throw some figures down on the table. Before I do, let me explain why it's so hard to discuss the strategy that's involved and why it's so compelling to play a game with alternating activation. And it all comes down to the uniqueness of the table state at any given moment. Let me explain. Every single time you activate a unit, the game state changes. The geometry, the geography, and the math changes, and you have to reassess and reanalyze. And there are so many variables involved that it's really hard to talk about this from a universal perspective. You can really only talk about individual instances and how you think about the game within those individual instances, which may or may not apply in any given game. So it's a lot harder to talk about this from a universal perspective, but we really need to start focusing more on the depth of the complexity that arises from alternating activation. Let me throw some figures down on the table. And this here is going to be our big boy. He's a 28 millimeter figure, but he is the heavy for Team Evil. I have a Dark Lord here. He's got the Dark Lord symbol on his shield, and he's got the great big honking helmet, so you can tell he is in charge. And then he has 3 faceless minions, and they have big old swords. I'm going to put them down over here, and of course they are Team Evil. We're doing Fantasy Skirmish. Those are the figures I have to hand. They're easy to use. So there you go, 3 units, 1, 2, 3. On the other side of the table, we are going to have a human champion. See, there he is with the torch and the backpack and everything, fresh out of the dungeon. He is going to be assisted by a small unit of 3 elves. These are, I have no idea where he comes from. I think he's an old Ratham figure. This guy, these come from alternative armies, and this guy comes from, I believe he's part of the old Demon World line. You can get it at Ralpartha, Europe these days. And as do these wood elves that I've painted up with more sea elf colors. So we got some elfy spearmen down here that are going to be assisting. And then because this is the Alliance of Good, again, we've got some 15 millimeter figures from the Demon World 15 millimeter line. And they are some nice chunky dwarves with the big battle axes. For the start of, and then of course, this is one-page rules. So we have to add one more little ingredient to the recipe here, don't we? Objective markers, 1, 2. This is a little miniature model of the way the game operates and the way the game is played. As we get into this discussion, bear in mind, I think the genuine lesson to be learned here is that live plays are far more valuable to understand one-page rules than just sitting down and going through an army list and saying, these guys ignore cover. These guys can move through terrain without a penalty. These guys get an extra 2 inches on advance and 4 on charge. This is where the genuine lessons come in. To avoid all that, I have 3 units on each side. We're just going to assume for the moment that they all have quality 4, defense 4. This means we have a completely symmetric battlefield, fairly boring, but it does allow us to discuss the benefits and the intriguing aspects of alternating activation. You and I are sitting on the near side of the table, and some jerk is sitting on that side of the table, and we now get activation on the first turn. So in a situation like this, we have to choose. We only get 1 unit to move. Do we want to secure one of the objective markers with a unit? Suppose we do. We've moved up and we've secured this objective marker. The game state has changed. Our opponent now has a choice to make, a meaningful choice. Does he want to take the other objective, or does he allow us to maintain the initiative by attacking? And if he attacks the objective that we hold, does he bring his heavy hitter over first, or does he bring his mook troops up to see what kind of damage they can do? This is a meaningful choice. This will direct the flow of the game. And I gotta be honest, and of course, because we've stipulated that these all have identical stats, the choice is even less meaningful than it would be in a regular game where we've got a model with tough 6 versus 3 models over here. This is our heavy hitter. If we're playing a genuine game with a big ogre, we're going to want to squat on this and dominate it. Now, the problem with moving him up is that it allows the champion to get into position, and we're going to be able to develop a 2-on-1 over here to knock out their best fighter. Of course, we are giving up the 2-on-1 on this side of the table, and the question then becomes, well, who's going to have the most resources left at the end of that fight? If the bad guys win over here, but all they've got is their leader and 1 mook, but we win over here when we've only lost 1 mook, this now is a win for us because we have more resources after those fights are over, and we may be able to come over and squat or even just challenge for this at the end of the game as our spearmen step up. And even if our leader dies, the fact that we've got spearmen operating as a blocking force means killing them might not be enough. Even with a consolidation move, the enemy hero might not be able to get close enough to seize this objective, although I guess if these are far enough apart, he may be forced between maintaining this one for the tie. Although if we can draw him off, right? So here we have a situation, an end game situation, where, let me put our heroes back in position. So our heroes are fighting here on turn 4, and we have a little blocking force that even if the enemy champion defeats our champion, the best he can do is run into these guys, and he can't even attack on this turn 3. Maybe even on turn 4, we have the option of moving up just far enough that, oh, well, he took this one, but he's never going to take that one. We can play for the tie. Even with a situation as simple as this, and you can see, even with a situation as simple as this, trying to discuss the ins and outs and how to think about alternating activation, it is so situationally dependent that it's very difficult to make a video that applies often enough for all of the viewers out there in YouTube land to be interested enough to watch it. But I think this is a fascinating conversation, particularly when it comes to cavalry. When you've got speedy units that can sit in position and they offer the option of targeting one of 2 objective markers, that is an enormously powerful unit. In games that I have played, I have parked cavalry in my backfield and just waited. Turn 1 goes by and they don't move. Turn 2 goes by and they don't move. I want to see where these guys are going to be weakest. So here's our enemy. Look, they have secured, and there's stuff going on, right? We've got the minimum of 3 objectives. We're tied, and our enemy has secured these 2 objectives, and now on turn 4, because he can move 14 inches, and he hasn't been activated, he hasn't taken any wounds, he's going to dominate, and in the late stages, he can seize objectives. And this is one of the things that I don't see a whole lot of people talking about, that having a ready reserve that can quickly move about the battlefield, it doesn't have to be a fast unit. It can also be a ranger. Is that what we call the figures that ignore terrain? No, it's okay. It's called, I know why I'm thinking that. It's called Strider. They call him Strider. He's one of those rangers. That amuses me that it works that way, that rangers have Strider. I think Ranger might be, no, Fleet Foot, what is it called in Dragon Rampant? Something like that. The other special ability, so that's a huge ability that I don't see discussed so much, that even if this is a relatively weak figure, just leaving it back there, just threatening. Sometimes you don't even have to do anything to influence the battle. You don't have to be active. You just have to pose a threat of action to complicate your enemy's lives. The same thing is true for a unit that has Strider. Here is an objective marker in rough going, and here is our unit of halflings. They don't care about no rough going. They ignore it. They're going to be able to move up here, and anybody else that wants to attack, when you combine this, for example, with Scout, if you've got a couple of units of halflings and you can get one halfling outside, 6 inches outside of the rough going, and the enemy has to fight their way past him, this is one of the benefits of Scout. If you can get a Scout into the front to where he can serve as a speed bump, stealing a march on your opponents and moving him up immediately forces your opponent to deal with him. It does use your first activation, but there are lots of instances where using an activation buys you time. Because now our enemy has to deal with you. You've got time to bring your second unit up, particularly when they've got Strider. And now, win, lose, or draw, this unit, if you can get them close enough, they're only able to move 3 inches. Now, if they're further than 6 inches away, they have to spend a whole turn. You just spent one full turn, 25% of the game, moving up to attack these guys. And now it's on turn 3. You've got 2 turns to deal with them. And even if you do, this powerful unit that you might have preferred to grab this, secure it at the end of round 2, you can't afford to do that anymore because you're 6 inches away. You have to go straight at them. This is an interesting set of decision points to have to make. I don't see a whole lot of people talking about that. I could be wrong. People could be having those conversations all over, and YouTube's algorithm just isn't showing it to me. So by all means, again, recommend your favorite channels down in the comments. The other important conversation to have is that when you've rolled a 6 on the number of objectives, if you got 5 objectives on the table, you only need to hold 3. Now, you might want to try to grab a 4th. You might want to threaten a 4th. But if you grab 3, which 3 do you want to grab? I have played in games where the team that started on the near side of the table wound up grabbing these 3 objective markers. They just ignored these because the enemy units came up too far. And because I had a cavalry-heavy army, they were able to get into the backfield and secure these 3. I've seen units trade places. They get pushed back this way and say, you know what, that's fine, I'll just move up to 3. Trying to choose which of the objectives to focus your forces on is another huge aspect of this game that I think it gets short shrift. And maybe that's because it is so situationally dependent that you need to play through a game and get into a position where you start thinking about, well, wait a minute. I've already seized these 2. Now I've got 3 more choices. And I've got my guy back here. I'm threatening 3, 4, and 5. His tar pit is over here, and he can't threaten 5. So maybe by squatting on 5, the only guy left, he's got to choose. And I've seen these swap around. I'm telling you, man, this is a really amazing game because of the alternating activation and the need to secure just a majority of the objective markers. Even more interesting is when you only have 4. Because now grabbing 2 is not enough. And once you grab 2, you only need to threaten 1 other. You just need to deny it to the other player. How do you do that within the realm of alternating activation? That's why we play the games. And that's why one-page rules is so compelling, because it is so situationally dependent. Because the game state changes so often, you are constantly engaged, not just in the details of, what do I need to roll to hit? What do I need to roll to defend? Do I have this special ability? But because you are constantly in a situation where you are playing, well, if I go there, then he can go there. If I go there, he can go here. But if I go there and he goes there, that opens up my guys to go here. The whole thing becomes a chess match in a way that very few games replicate. Certainly not the big game that was the inspiration for Age of Fantasy Skirmish. What's the take-home message? The most interesting part of this game is also the most difficult to produce content for. And maybe what we need to start doing, and I'm looking at myself here, right? I'm looking in the mirror. Maybe what we need to do is stop worrying so much about the abilities of units and stop worrying so much about the thought that goes into, well, oh boy, stop worrying so much about, I just had another thought. One of the other key things is, hey, look, we are at the start of the game. Where do we want to put these objective markers? There's a whole video waiting for that. Do I want to put it in the rough going? Not if I only have mounted figures. It negates their speed advantage. I want to try and keep them in the wide open. Do I want them really close to a deployment zone? I might not get that deployment zone. Remember, we put the objective markers first, and then we roll to decide. Do I want to put them near one of the deployment zones, or do I want to keep them as close to the center as possible? Not knowing where I'm going to deploy. If I'm really confident that I've got enough variety in my units that I can squat on one and race over and grab another, putting them on opposite sides of the table might be of benefit. If I've got lots of units that are good in rough terrain, yeah, of course I want to put one of them in the rough terrain. But do I want to bunch them up? Do I want to spread them out? It all depends on my army list, doesn't it? So for that reason, again, the complexity of the game makes it really difficult to talk about these. And really about the only way I can think to do it, maybe you got a better idea, but the only way I can think to do it is in a real game situation. Set up the terrain, set up the armies, and talk about what the armies are good at and bad at, and then start discussing, look, I'm just talking about where to put these things. If I put 2 of them in here, then what does that mean? How does that affect the flow of the battle? That's how we should be talking about this. Not worrying so much about the balance of the armies. Not worrying so much about whether this army is really worth this ability is worth the extra 10 points. The play is the thing. And that's what I really love about the one-page rule system. So something to think about, something to chew on, something to maybe, if you make these videos, something to maybe address. And even if you don't, spend a little more time thinking about how the game is played and less about how to prepare to play the game. Don't dream about what might happen. Make it happen. Till next time, I'm praying for you.